Welcome to Tell Me More Stories Told as Podcast. Today we're diving headfirst into a document that really echoes through history. The Magna Carta. Forget, dusty museum displays.
Yeah.
We're actually unearthing the thrilling story behind this great charter of freedoms.
Yeah, get ready for quite a tale. Rebellion, a clash of wills, and the, well, surprising birth of an idea that genuinely changed the world.
That's it. This isn't just about some, ancient piece of parchment, is it?
Not at all. The Magna Carta's beanie. It's fascinating. From a kind of desperate attempt to rein in a rogue king to becoming this global symbol of liberty, it's full of drama, unexpected turns.
So we'll explore what sparked it all. The grievances, the promises.
Exactly. We'll look at the powder keg that led to its creation, the groundbreaking promises it contained, and crucially, how its meaning has been reinterpreted across centuries. It's still relevant today, remarkably.
Okay, let's set the scene then. Imagine a king,
Yeah.
King John. And he's so unbelievably unpopular, really disliked, that his own powerful barons, the nobility, felt they had to do something drastic.
But not just grumble behind his back.
No, exactly. They didn't just complain amongst themselves. They actually forged a formal document, a written list of demands to try and curb his absolute power.
It wasn't a polite request, was it?
Definitely not. This was a high-stakes showdown. You had the threat of actual civil war hanging in the air.
And this dramatic confrontation, it really kicks off in the early 13th century. King John is the central figure and, yeah, widely resented.
Why so unpopular? What was the main issue?
Well, several things. He had a knack for losing battles, for one. He lost significant ancestral lands over in France.
Right, costly defeats.
Very costly. And back home, he imposed these crushing taxes on his barons, largely to fund these, well, unsuccessful military campaigns.
So he's losing abroad and making enemies at home. Great combination.
Precisely. And his style of rule, it was characterized by this strong belief in his own absolute authority, a conviction that he was, above the very laws governing the land. He ruled by force and will, as contemporaries put it.
And the barons, they must have been feeling the squeeze.
Oh, absolutely. They were reaching their breaking point. Think about it. Constantly being pressured for cash through these heavy taxes, burdened by debts owed directly to the crown, and just subject to the king's unpredictable decisions. His arbitrary judgments.
Yeah, it sounds like a recipe for, serious discontent among the aristocracy.
And eventually, that simmering resentment boiled over. It became organized resistance. These rebel barons, they united. They actually took an oath to protect the rights of the church and the realm.
And what was their main demand?
Their core demand was pretty straightforward initially. They wanted John to formally reaffirm the Charter of Liberties. This was a document issued way back by King Henry III about a century earlier.
Okay, so they were looking back to precedent?
Exactly. They saw this earlier charter as a kind of historical acknowledgement of their rights that they felt John was just trampling all over.
Now, this is where the intrigue really starts, right? The negotiations, lack thereof.
Yeah, but both sides sensed how serious this was getting. They both appealed to a major power broker of the time, Pope Innocent III.
Well, bringing in the Pope.
Right. And John, ever the political operator, he tried to play for time. He was hoping to get the Pope's backing and, undermine the barons' position.
But the barons weren't just sitting around waiting.
No, they weren't. They drafted their own document, something historians now call the Unknown Charter of Liberties. It's a fascinating glimpse into their thinking at that stage.
What did it say? Was it similar to the final Magna Carta?
It drew very heavily on Henry III's charter. In fact, 7 of its key articles eventually found their way into the barons' formal demands and then into the Magna Carta itself. So it shows they were grounding their arguments in precedent, even as they pushed for new limits.
But John's delaying tactics, appealing to the Pope, that didn't work out for him.
Ultimately, no, it backfired. The rebel barons reached a kind of critical point. They made a decisive move. They renounced their feudal ties to John.
Wow. Okay. What does that mean exactly? Renouncing feudal ties.
It means they formally declared they no longer owed him the duties and services, military service, council, financial aid, that barons traditionally owed their king in exchange for their land. It was a fundamental rejection of his authority.
A massive step.
Huge. And crucially, they seized control of London. Capturing the capital gave them immense leverage and significantly boosted their support across the country. After that, John's attempts at trying to negotiate or find some kind of arbitration just fell apart.
So the tables had turned.
Completely. Exactly. With London in rebel hands and their ranks swelling, John was facing a full-blown crisis. He recognized the urgency. It was actually John himself who instructed Archbishop Stephen Langton.
The Archbishop of Canterbury.
That's him. Langton had already been trying to mediate, working with the barons on their grievances. John told him, basically, okay, try and broker peace talks.
And that leads us to Runnymede.
Exactly. So, June 1215. The stage is set for this, well, iconic meeting. King John, the rebel leaders, they gather at Runnymede.
Which was neutral ground.
Yes, strategically neutral. It was a meadow by the Thames, conveniently located between the royal stronghold at Windsor Castle and the main rebel base, which was then at Staines.
Why Runnymede specifically? Any particular reason?
Well, it wasn't just convenient. It was actually a traditional place for important assemblies, and perhaps more importantly, it offered a sense of security for both sides. Less risk of a surprise attack, you know. It felt safer.
Okay, so they meet. What happens then? Do the barons just present their demands?
Pretty much. They presented John with their detailed proposals for reform. This document was formally titled The Articles of the Barons.
The Articles.
Yeah.
Not yet the Magna Carta.
Not yet. Over the next 10 days or so, Archbishop Langton played this absolutely pivotal role. He was the mediator, skillfully transforming these initial demands, the articles, into a more formal document, a proposed peace agreement.
And that became Magna Carta.
That's what would later be known as Magna Carta, yes.
Yeah.
Meaning Great Charter. By June 15th, they'd reached a general agreement. And then on June 19th, the deal was sort of sealed. The rebel barons reaffirmed their loyalty to John, and copies of this landmark charter were officially issued.
So what did it actually promise? What were the key points?
Well, it's vital to understand it addressed the barons' specific grievances, things like limits on excessive fines, inheritance rights, stuff like that. But it also laid out broader principles.
Like what?
Things like guaranteeing the rights of the church, protection against arbitrary or illegal imprisonment, a big one.
Yeah.
The promise of access to fair and swift justice.
Justice for all. Or just the barons.
Primarily focused on the rights of free men, which, let's be honest, mainly meant the barons and knights at the time. But it did contain some clauses that offered a degree of protection even to serfs, the unfree peasants. So it wasn't entirely exclusive.
Okay. And what about the king's power? Taxes.
Crucially, yes, limitations on taxation and those feudal payments owed to the crown. It stipulated that certain new taxes would require the consent of the barons, the common council of the kingdom, as it was put.
Taking away the king's blank check, essentially.
In a way, yes, and perhaps the most radical part, the most innovative clause, was what later became known as Clause 61, the Security Clause.
The Security Clause, what did that do?
It established a council of 25 barons, their job, to monitor John's adherence to the charter.
Monitor the king. How?
If John failed to comply with the terms and didn't fix the problem within 40 days of being notified, these 25 barons were empowered, get this, to seize his lands and castles until he made amends.
Wow. They could seize the king's property.
Yes. It was an incredible check on royal power. Basically, a mechanism for the barons to collectively hold the king accountable by force, if necessary.
That's astonishing for the time. A direct challenge to the king's authority.
It really was. A truly groundbreaking departure from how monarchy was usually understood.
Hmm?
But, and it's a big but, this attempt at peace, it proved tragically short-lived.
Oh. It didn't stick.
Not really. There was just too much deep-seated mistrust on both sides. Neither party seemed genuinely committed to actually implementing the agreement fully. And tellingly, the 25 barons chosen for that monitoring council, they were all leading figures in the rebellion, not exactly impartial observers.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like a recipe for long-term success.
It was a fragile peace destined to shatter. And King John, predictably, wasn't prepared to accept these limitations on his power for long.
So what did he do? Appeal to the Pope again?
You guessed it. He went back to Pope Innocent III. He argued the Magna Carta infringed on his royal rights, but also, cleverly, that it undermined the Pope's own authority because the Pope was technically John's feudal overlord.
Oh, interesting angle. How did the Pope react this time?
Decisively.
Yeah.
In August of that same year, 1215, the Pope issued a papal bull, a formal declaration declaring the Magna Carta null and void of all validity forever.
Null and void. Just like that.
Just like that. He forbade both John and the barons from observing its terms, threatening excommunication, basically, being kicked out of the church if they did.
Wow. So almost as soon as it was created, this groundbreaking document was condemned by the highest religious authority in Europe.
Exactly. And that papal annulment, it just poured fuel on the fire. Conflict erupted again, plunging England into what's known as the First Barons' War.
So back to fighting.
Right. The rebel barons, now convinced that no lasting peace was possible with John, took another drastic step. They offered the English throne to Louis, the son of the King of France.
Offered the throne to the French prince. Talk about raising the stakes.
It was getting serious. But then, fate intervened. King John died quite suddenly in October 1216, probably from dysentery while campaigning.
John dies. What happens then? Who takes over?
He left his heir, a young boy named Henry III. He was only 9 years old, and the kingdom was still engulfed in civil war.
A child king in the middle of a war. Not ideal.
Not ideal at all. But the Regency government, the people ruling on behalf of young Henry, they made a very smart strategic decision.
What was that?
They reissued the Magna Carta in 1216.
Reissued it, even after the Pope annulled it.
Yes, but crucially, they stripped out some of the most radical clauses, particularly that security clause, Clause 61, that gave the barons power to seize castles.
Ah, okay. Why reissue it then?
It was a political move. They hoped that by reissuing a modified, less threatening version, they could win over some of the wavering barons, rally support around the young king, and undermine Louis's claim to the throne.
A clever tactic in a crisis. Did it work?
It helped, and the Magna Carta story, well, it just kept going. In 1217, as part of the peace treaty that finally did end the First Barons' War, the document was reissued once more.
Again.
Yes. And it was at this point, in 1217, that it officially got the name Magna Carta, the Great Charter.
Why then?
To distinguish it from another shorter charter issued at the same time, called the Charter of the Forest, which dealt specifically with rights related to the royal forests. So you have the Great Charter and the Forest Charter.
Got it. So the name we know today really stuck after that turbulent period.
Correct. And the narrative continues. Fast forward a few years to 1225. Henry III, now ruling in his own name, needed money. He needed the barons to grant him new taxes.
And they agreed.
They did. But in exchange for something, Henry reissued the charter yet again, but this time, crucially, he declared that this reissue was of his own spontaneous and free will.
Why was that declaration important?
Because it implied it wasn't forced upon him like the 1215 version. Issuing it freely gave this 1225 version even greater authority and legitimacy. And it's largely this 1225 version, confirmed later by Edward the Sirst in 1297, that became the definitive text for centuries.
Okay, before we move on to how this charter evolved over the centuries, because its story is clearly far from over, just a quick reminder. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the twists and turns of history here on Tell Me More, make sure to hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss out on any of our future explorations into the stories that have shaped our world.
Right. So we've seen the Magna Carta's dramatic birth, its near-death experience, and its multiple rebirths in the early 13th century. But its journey was, as you say, far from over.
How was it used in the centuries immediately following? Did people refer back to it often?
They did, yeah. Throughout the medieval period, it was frequently cited in legal cases, mostly concerning the actions of royal officials, sheriffs, bailiffs, tax collectors, making sure they didn't overstep their bounds. English monarchs were also repeatedly asked to reconfirm it, often when they wanted Parliament to grant them taxes.
So it remained a sort of benchmark for good governance.
In a way, yes, although its practical impact definitely fluctuated. As Parliament grew stronger and started making its own laws, the reliance on Magna Carta as the sole check sometimes lessened. But it never disappeared.
It's remarkable how a document from such a specific crisis just kept being relevant.
Absolutely. Then you get to the 16th century, the Tudor period, and there's a significant shift in how it's viewed. Interestingly, Tudor historians often presented King John in a more, well, favorable light.
Really? After everything we've heard?
Yeah, kind of portraying him as a strong king standing up against the Pope. Different priorities back then, I suppose. And this is also when the first printed editions of Magna Carta start appearing.
Making it more accessible.
In theory. Though they often used the 1225 version and sometimes got the history a bit muddled. But towards the end of the 16th century, you see this growing antiquarian interest. Scholars started looking at Magna Carta differently again.
How so?
They began interpreting it as this fundamental restoration of ancient English freedoms that existed before the Normans arrived in 1066.
Was that historically accurate?
Not entirely, no. It was a bit of a romanticized view looking back to a supposed Anglo-Saxon Golden Age. But this interpretation, viewing Magna Carta as ancient constitutionalism reborn, gained a lot of traction.
So a bit of historical myth-making creeping in.
Precisely. And that particular interpretation became hugely important in the 17th and 18th centuries. This was a time of intense political struggle between the Crown and Parliament, especially under James I and Charles I.
The English Civil War period.
Exactly. Figures like the famous jurist Sir Edward Coke. He used Magna Carta extensively. He wielded it as a weapon against the idea of the divine right of kings. He argued it proved the king was subject to the law, not above it.
So it became a key political document in that fight.
Absolutely central. Coke's interpretations, while later critiqued by historians for sometimes stretching the original meaning, were incredibly influential. Magna Carta was explicitly cited in the Petition of Right in 1628, a major statement of liberties presented to Charles I.
It really cemented its place as a symbol against absolute power.
Indeed. Even during the short period when England was a republic, without a king, while some questioned the relevance of a charter agreed with a monarch, others saw its core principles like due process as fundamental.
And after the monarchy was restored.
Following the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which further limited royal power, Magna Carta was firmly reinterpreted as a foundational document of English liberties, and its influence started to spread even further.
Across the Atlantic, to America.
Yes, profoundly. The early American colonists were steeped in this tradition of English rights. They saw Magna Carta as part of their heritage. Its principles found their way into colonial charters and ultimately into the founding documents of the United States.
Whereas specifically in the U.S. Constitution.
Most notably, you can see its echo in the Fifth Amendment's guarantee of due process of law, the idea that the government can't deprive you of life, liberty, or property without following fair procedures, and also in the principles behind habeas corpus, the right not to be imprisoned unlawfully.
It's amazing. Tracing that line directly from a field in Runnymede in 1215 all the way to the U.S. Bill of Rights.
It really is. Now, jump forward again, 19th to 21st centuries. The traditional view, the sort of Whig interpretation, Magna Carta as this inevitable first step towards modern democracy that was dominant for a long time.
But historians started questioning that.
Yes, later historians began to nuance that view. They emphasized quite rightly its original context. It was primarily focused on the rights and privileges of the baronial elite in 1215, not universal democracy as we understand it.
So managing expectations about what it actually was at the start.
Exactly. And interestingly, despite this historical reassessment and the fact that most of its original 63 clauses have actually been repealed from English law over the centuries.
Most of it isn't even law anymore.
The vast majority, no. Yet Magna Carta remains this incredibly potent symbol, a symbol of liberty, of the rule of law. It's still frequently invoked by politicians, lawyers, activists around the world. Its 800th anniversary in 2015 saw huge commemorations.
So its symbolic power has almost outstripped its actual legal force.
You could definitely argue that. Legally speaking, in England and Wales today, only 3 clauses from that later 1297 version officially remain on the statute books.
Only 3. Which ones?
One guarantees the freedom of the English Church. Another upholds the ancient liberties of the City of London. And the most famous one, Clause 29 in that version, combining Clauses 39 and 40 from 1215, enshrines the right to due legal process. To no one will we sell. To no one deny or delay right or justice.
That last one still sounds incredibly important.
Absolutely fundamental. And its influence isn't just limited to the UK. Some of its core principles remain technically enforced in the legal systems of some Commonwealth countries too, like New Zealand, parts of Australia.
And symbolically, it stands for.
Symbolically, it's seen as this timeless testament to the idea that nobody, not even the highest ruler, is above the law. It's considered a cornerstone of the UK's unwritten constitution. And it's deeply revered in the US as a crucial ancestor of their own Constitution and Bill of Rights.
People can still see original copies, right?
Yes, remarkably. Original copies from 1215 and later reissues are carefully preserved and displayed in places like the British Library, Lincoln Cathedral, and Salisbury Cathedral. There are also replicas in many important locations, like the U.S. National Archives, tangible links to this pivotal moment.
And you mentioned a really interesting detail earlier about how copies were spread around England way back when.
Ah, yes, that's a great little fun fact. In 1297, when King Edward I reissued the charters Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest partly to get funds, he also made a decree.
What did he order?
He mandated that copies of these charters be sent out to cathedral churches throughout our realm, there to remain, and shall be read before the people 2 times by the year.
Read out loud to the public. Twice a year.
Exactly. It was an effort to publicize its contents, to make sure people knew about these rights and limitations on royal power. And that decree is actually why Salzer's Cathedral still has its original 1215 Magna Carta copy proudly on display today. It's a direct result of that medieval PR effort.
That's fantastic. A piece of living history right there. So let's try and wrap this up. What does this all mean for us today? We have this document born from a pretty brutal clash between an unpopular king and his fed-up barons. It wasn't perfect. Its original focus was mainly on the elite. We have to acknowledge that.
Absolutely. It wasn't a democratic manifesto in the modern sense.
Yet these core principles, limiting arbitrary power, demanding due process, the idea of swift justice, they clearly resonated far beyond 13th century England. They evolved over centuries, became a cornerstone for broader freedoms, for the rule of law, really, across the globe.
And here's what I find really thought-provoking. Even though, as we said, most of its actual clauses are no longer active law in England, its symbolic power is just immense. It still serves as this constant, potent reminder of that fundamental tension, that push and pull between authority and individual liberty.
A tension that's still very much alive today.
Absolutely. It continues to shape our societies, our legal system, our political debates.
So as you, our listener, reflect on this deep dive into the Magna Carta's incredible story, maybe consider this. How does a document written over 800 years ago in such a vastly different world still hold such significance, still spark debate? What does its enduring legacy tell us, perhaps, about our own understanding of rights of justice and the necessary limits we need to place on power today?
It's fascinating, isn't it? This ancient charter, born of conflict, still raises such vital questions for us right here in the 21st century.